Imagine living in a country where the government insists serial killers don't exist. Now imagine dozens of children and young women disappearing anyway. For more than a decade, fear spread across parts of the Soviet Union as bodies were discovered in forests, fields, and near railway lines. Investigators searched desperately for answers, but the killer always seemed to stay one step ahead. Police questioned thousands of suspects. Entire task forces were created. An innocent man was even executed for crimes he didn't commit. And while authorities chased the wrong people, the real murderer continued hunting for new victims. By the time he was finally caught, he had confessed to more than 50 murders. His name was Andrei Chikatilo, and this is the story of how one of the most notorious serial killers in history managed to evade capture for years while hiding in plain sight. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in 1936 in a small village in what is now Ukraine. His early years were marked by hardship. The Soviet countryside was still recovering from devastating famine, political repression, and the effects of war. According to later accounts, his mother told him stories about an older brother who had allegedly been kidnapped and eaten during a time of extreme starvation. Historians have questioned whether this story was true, but it reportedly had a profound effect on the young Chikatilo. Growing up, he was shy, socially awkward, and often isolated from other children. He struggled to fit in and was frequently described as withdrawn. Classmates mocked him. He found it difficult to form relationships. As he entered adulthood, these problems only became more severe. Behind the image of an ordinary Soviet citizen, resentment and frustration were building. No one could have imagined what those feelings would eventually become. As an adult, Chikatilo appeared completely ordinary. He attended university, found work, got married, and became a father. To neighbors and co-workers, he seemed unremarkable, just another Soviet man trying to build a normal life. For a time, he worked as a teacher. But there were troubling signs. Former students later reported incidents of inappropriate behavior, and complaints were made about his conduct around children. Nothing at the time suggested he would become one of history's most prolific serial killers. Years passed. He changed jobs, moved between workplaces, and blended into everyday life. Yet beneath the surface, darker impulses were growing stronger. The man who appeared so ordinary on the outside was beginning to develop dangerous fantasies, and eventually, those fantasies would turn into violence. As the number of victims grew, investigators faced a serious problem. Many Soviet officials refused to believe a serial killer could be responsible. Cases were treated separately, and crucial connections were missed. The killer benefited from every mistake. Then came a tragic turning point. A man named Alexander Kravchenko was arrested, convicted, and executed for one of the murders. Authorities believed the case had been solved, but the killings didn't stop. New victims continued to appear. The real killer was still free. Fear spread across the Rostov region as more bodies were discovered. With every new victim, it became clear that investigators were hunting the wrong man. And while police searched for answers, Andrei Chikatilo continued living as an ordinary Soviet citizen. By the mid-1980s, authorities could no longer ignore the truth. A serial killer was operating across the Soviet Union. One of the largest investigations in Soviet history was launched. Thousands of people were questioned, train stations were monitored, and undercover officers were deployed across the region. Leading the investigation was Detective Isa Kostoyev, who became convinced that all the murders were connected. Slowly, investigators began building a profile of the killer. But despite years of effort, the Rostov Ripper continued to evade capture. The man they were searching for blended perfectly into everyday Soviet life, and no one suspected that he was watching the investigation unfold from the sidelines. In 1990, investigators noticed a suspicious man near a railway station. He matched several elements of the profile and behaved strangely around potential victims. Police placed him under surveillance. That man was Andrei Chikatilo. For weeks, investigators quietly followed his movements, gathering evidence. Finally, they made their move. After years of terror, Chikatilo was arrested. At first, he denied everything. Investigators, however, had spent years tracking the killer and weren't convinced by his explanations. As questioning continued, more evidence began linking him to multiple crime scenes across the region. But as the evidence mounted, his story began to collapse. Eventually, he confessed to dozens of murders and led investigators to locations only the killer could have known. After more than a decade of fear, the Rostov Ripper had finally been caught. Chikatilo's trial began in 1992 and quickly became one of the most notorious court cases in Soviet history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, investigators, and the families of victims seeking answers. For his own protection, Chikatilo was placed inside a metal cage. Throughout the proceedings, he often behaved erratically, shouting at the court and attempting to disrupt the trial. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Investigators presented witness testimony, forensic evidence, and details that only the killer could have known. As the trial continued, the scale of his crimes became impossible to ignore. After months of hearings, Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders. The man who had terrorized an entire region would finally face justice. In 1994, all of Chikatilo's appeals were rejected. After years of investigation, arrests, confessions, and courtroom battles, the case was finally coming to an end. On February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed. But his story didn't end there. His crimes exposed major flaws in the Soviet criminal justice system and changed the way serial murder investigations were conducted. Even decades later, the Rostov Ripper remains one of the most infamous serial killers in history. For more than 10 years, he hid in plain sight while authorities searched desperately for a monster. What they eventually discovered was perhaps the most terrifying part of all. The monster looked completely ordinary. In the history of the Soviet Union, the name Andrei Chikatilo stands as a reminder of one of the darkest criminal cases of the 20th century. Over the course of many years, a hidden pattern of violence spread fear across multiple regions, while authorities struggled to understand and stop what was happening. Chikatilo's crimes exposed serious failures in communication, investigation, and the ability to recognize patterns in time. But beyond the headlines and the case files, the story carries a deeper meaning. Evil does not always appear obvious, and ignoring warning signs can allow tragedy to grow in silence. Eventually, justice caught up with him, but the damage had already been done to countless lives and families. The final lesson of this story is not about fear, but about awareness, responsibility, and vigilance. Society learns from such cases so that mistakes are not repeated, and so that protection of human life is always taken more seriously than denial or delay.